So, welcome everyone to this morning's workshop, revamping your sales process focused on COVID-19. Today, of course, we are accompanied by our prominent EIR at the DMZ, Mike Orloff, and Mike will be leading today's workshop. And I would love to introduce Mike to all of you. Mike has been with the DMZ for a few years as our lead sales EIR or entrepreneur in residence, and he's the founder and head of sales at Sherpa. And Mike focuses on building high performance sales teams, scaling startups, coaching, defining sales strategy, and developing systems, tools, and processes to optimize operations. And we are very lucky to have Mike here today. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Omar. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out to my workshop, or I should say zooming into my workshop. I think one of the interesting aspects of this COVID environment is the location no longer matters. I know this is our DMZ YYZ workshop, but it feels exactly the same as the workshop I did last week for the local accelerator cohort. So I hope this sense of global community continues over the longer term, because I think it actually feels good that we're all together. I'm a little sad that we're not together in person, but I do like the spirit of the global community. We're going to talk today about how we change our sales process to respond to how much and how quickly our markets and environment have changed. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about our normal sales process and how we build our sales process and what that looks like. So I work with a lot of founders and sales leaders to develop their sales playbook. And one of the first things I ask them to do is walk me through their typical sales stages. And almost all the companies start with a very similar process, and it looks something like this. So we start with our leads, and sometimes those leads are inbound, sometimes they're outbound. We use different platforms or mechanisms for reaching out to our leads. But generally, the object is to have a conversation, because if we have a conversation and it's a good conversation, then we qualify the lead. And if the lead's qualified, we can move on to a demo or a meeting or a presentation. And then we can send a proposal or a quote, and then we can close the deal. But of course, we can't shake hands anymore. So my preferred signal is just a loose shaka. So let's actually break this down and look at some of the key elements that go into the sales playbook for each of these stages. So when we start with our leads, we need to really understand who we want to sell to. So who we want to sell to is our ideal customer profile. And your ICP is maybe not who you want to sell to, but it's the company that is the best fit for your product or service. So this is the company that is best suited or the best fit for your solution. And a lot of times we start with very general parameters for our ICP. But the more we can understand why they buy and what makes them buy, the better we get at defining who our real ICP is, and the better we can be at selling to our ICP. So once we know who the company is, we want to know who in the company we're selling to, who those buyer personas are, what's important to them, and how we're going to sell to them. And if we've got a simple, low-cost product or a service, then there may be just one buyer persona. But the more expensive the solution is, the more enterprisey the product may be, the more likely there are to be multiple people involved in the decision-making process. So it's important to understand the roles that everybody plays and how we need to reach and address and satisfy each of those different roles. Once we've got a really clear picture of who we're selling to, then we need to take action. So we need to understand where those leads are coming from. If they're inbound leads, what are the sources? How are we generating those leads? If we're going to have an outbound process, how do we find the leads? How do we build our lists? How do we identify who the right people are to reach out to? And then how are we going to handle those leads? How are we going to respond? And once we've got that settled, now we can start to plan how we're going to engage with those leads. So what do we need to do prior to reaching out? How much research do we need to do? What's important to know that we can use in our reach out strategy? What cadence are we going to use to reach out to our leads? When I say cadence, I mean what frequency, what duration, what media are we going to use? What messaging is going to go into each of those touch points? If we're making calls, we need a call script. If we're leaving voicemail, we need a voicemail script. If we're sending email, we need templates for each email. We need to know how long we're going to reach out. We need to know how frequently. And we need to track and manage our whole prospecting process so we can develop a good prospecting rhythm and understand what's working. So one of the first things we want to understand are what are all the different prospecting paths or results that may emerge. So we know that we've got the ideal path, which is we talk to somebody, we qualify them, and they become an opportunity. But there's a lot of variations on that. What happens if we run through our entire cadence and we don't get a response? What do we do with those leads? Do we put them in a nurture program? Do we forget about them? Do we reach out to them again in 60 days or 90 days? What if somebody says they're not interested? What do we do with them? Again, nurture program, reach out to them again in the future. We need an opt-out option. And we need to understand how we're going to manage our CRM. And if you're early stage and you don't have a CRM yet, then at least capture your data in an Excel spreadsheet so you can upload it to a CRM later. So assuming we get engaged with our prospects, we can have a conversation, but we need to plan the conversation. We need to know what we're going to want to discuss. I think a lot of times when we have that initial conversation, we're really focused on qualification. And qualification is important because you want to make sure that you're spending time with the right prospects. But one of the challenges with qualification is it's very one-sided. Prospects don't like to be qualified. Prospects don't like to be grilled and asked a lot of questions. So I think we need to do more discovery. And discovery is really talking to the prospect to understand their business and how they operate. Because what you're really trying to do is understand how you're going to sell to them, how you're going to show how your product or service improves their business, saves them money, creates more opportunity, reduces risk, builds a compelling reason for them to proceed with your solution. And as you're having that conversation, you want to start to map out the buying journey. So what are the next steps? How do you prepare your prospect to go along that buying journey? And how do you recognize and understand that they're fully engaged and committed to the buying process? So assuming we have a qualified prospect, we can move on to the demo or the presentation. And I think a lot of times we're really excited to show people our product. We think our product will sell itself. But I think a lot of times we forget that we can't just show people the product and expect them to buy and recognize the benefit. So we need to set context for the demo. We need to have a clear agenda. We want to have objectives. Ideally, we want to have an agreement with the prospect prior to the demo on what will happen if the demo is successful. I see a lot of drop off in opportunities when sales reps tell me I ran the demo and they liked it, but then they went quiet. Well, a lot of times that's because the prospect was left to their own devices. So running a structured demo with a clear flow that demonstrates to the prospect not just what your product does, but explicitly how the prospect is going to use the product to solve a problem or deliver an opportunity that they're already committed to, is a much more effective demo. And then after the demo is finished, if we're going to close the deal, then we really need to understand the decision process. And if we're going to leave the customer after the demo, then we want to know what they're going to do. Who's going to be looking at the decision? What materials are they going to be looking at? What criteria is going to be used to make a decision? And what other steps are required? Are we submitting a proposal, a quote? Do we need a business case? Is there justification for the purchase? If we're sending a proposal, are we confident that we're proposing the right solution? Are we comfortable with the financial terms? Are there additional steps, like maybe a pilot required? And if there is, what's the criteria of the pilot? So before we're able to close, we need to understand what's required. And I think a lot of times closing seems to be the hardest part of the sales process, when it should really be the easiest part of the process. So if closing is easy, that's a signal that you've got a really good sales process, because closing is just a natural outcome of an effective sales process. Difficulty closing indicates that maybe you didn't do everything that you could have or should have done leading up to that decision point. All right, so let's assume that we've got our sales playbook built. We've got an effective sales process. Everything's fine. And then COVID-19 hits our market. And all of a sudden, everything gets really difficult. So let's talk about what's changed. And I think the first thing that we see change is people started freaking out. And I think this is lessening a little bit as we get deeper into the COVID environment. But there's still a lot of people that are stressed, that are concerned, that are worried. And I've had a lot of founders tell me that they're just uncomfortable reaching out to people in this environment. And I think if you're reaching out in the same way that you were reaching out before COVID hit, then that's definitely problematic. So we need to reach out and communicate with people differently. And I think that's another thing that's changed. I think we are communicating in a kinder way, in a more human and personal way. I think when we reach out, we need to acknowledge that things have changed, and we need to be really sensitive to what's going on with our customers and our prospects. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But the platforms and how we communicate have also changed. So as much as I love seeing people's kids and dogs in their homes and the different backgrounds they use on their Zoom meetings, it's really challenging to lose the face-to-face or, personal meetings and communicate effectively over video platforms. If you're familiar with Mehrabian's rule, you'll know that he says 7% of how we communicate is the words that we use. 38% is our tone, and 55% is our body language. And it's really hard to use body language over a video platform. If we were doing this workshop in person, I'd be walking around the room. I'd be using my hands to communicate. I'd be asking you questions. I'd be asking you to raise your hand. I'd do polls and surveys. It would be a much more interactive experience. So when we're selling or conducting meetings over video platforms, we need to really work hard to engage with our prospects and pay a lot of attention to tone and engagement. I'd love to have you ask me questions as we go through this, but it's difficult and it's awkward. So I'm going to save some time at the end and ask you to save up your questions so you can ask them at the end when it's in a little bit more of a controlled environment. But again, it's difficult, right? So we gotta really be sensitive to how we're communicating. All right, what else has changed? Well, there's businesses that are closed. Some temporary. Some are going to have a tough time reopening. There's empty streets, there's empty subway stations, there's empty sports arenas and hockey rinks and gyms. And, this is starting to change. Here in Toronto, in Canada, we're starting to come out of our lockdown and stores are starting to open. But they're opening under different circumstances and how they operate is changing. And if your market are businesses that are closed or operating under substantially reduced conditions, then you're going to have to change how you approach them. You're going to have to change how you reach out to them. But as much as there are businesses suffering, there's also a lot of businesses that are doing really well. There are essential goods like hand sanitizer and medical supplies and other critical supply chain elements that are in high demand. And there are factories and production outlets that are struggling to keep up with demand. And they're operating under different conditions. Delivery services are in tremendous demand. As actual reality becomes difficult, there are more and more opportunities for virtual reality, and virtual reality will enter new applications. There's all kinds of companies that are doing better than they've ever done. Shopify is helping companies sell online when they can't sell out of their store. We know Zoom is exploding. Amazon is doing incredibly well. Peloton is taking advantage of closed gyms and people that can't go to spin classes. And I mean, we can't all be Zoom or Amazon, but we can look to sell or help companies that are in thriving markets and take advantage of the changed environment. Okay, priorities have also changed. Some companies are just struggling to survive. Some companies are trying to figure out how to capitalize on new opportunities. But I think more than ever, companies are really taking a very hard look at the buying decision and being very careful with how they spend money. And, I've had a lot of companies tell me over the last couple months that people like our product, but they're saying they're not spending money. And I think part of that can be true, but I think a lot of it just comes back to what's important. And anytime you're selling a nice to have rather than a necessary to have, you're going to have a difficult time. So now more than ever, you really need to figure out how and why your product or service is important and position it in a way that companies need to buy it. Because companies will spend money on things that they clearly understand will help them. So we need to figure out how we can be that solution. And everybody's really trying to figure out what is going to be the new normal. And there are some obvious things, like we know we're going to be wearing masks, and we know that physical distancing is going to continue for a while, and we know there's going to be much more attention to disinfection and cleanliness. We know sports and entertainment are going to take a long time to come back, but we really need to look deeply at our customers and understand how their business is changing and how we can help be a part of that. So we've really got three options. The first option is we can sell now and keep selling like we've always sold. But if we're going to do that, then we've got to matter, we've got to be important, we've got to figure out who we're selling to and how we're going to do that. And if we're really struggling and we can't figure out how to sell now, then our second option is to build pipeline, to build community, to build interest, so that as the clouds start to lift, we're in a position to be able to convert those opportunities. And if we can't figure that out, then our only option is to wait it out. And nobody really wants to do this. The only bright side to waiting it out is it's a good time for product development and internal process. But if you're going to wait it out, you got to look hard at your finances and your runway. Make sure that you can wait it out, because it may take a while. And if you don't have the runway and you don't have the financing and you can't figure out how to sell, you're probably going to have to look at cutting quickly and deeply so that you can survive. Now, I think the good news is these aren't mutually exclusive. We don't have to pick one and stick with it. We can figure out how to sell while we're building pipeline, and really work towards that first option. I'm going to give you 8 strategies for dealing with the current COVID environment. And the first one I'm going to give you is 100% under your own control. And that is just stay positive, because we know we can't choose our environment. We know that the only thing we can control is our response to the environment. And if we're down, if we're feeling negative, it's really hard to be productive. If we can take a positive outlook, if we can look to the opportunity, we can think more creatively, we can come up with better ideas, we can be productive, and we can find a way to succeed. So whatever you need to do, whether it's go for a walk, watch kitten videos, meditate, do yoga, whatever it takes. Find a way to approach your business with a positive mindset. You'll be more productive. You'll increase your chances of success, and you'll just have better mental health. And I think as founders and leaders, it's especially important that we be positive, so we set a good example and are able to continue to inspire our teams and our staff. Second thing is really need to consider our ICP and whether we need to refine or redefine what that ICP is. I think we really need to understand why people are buying our products. I think it's a great time to talk to your customers. I think a lot of times when we define our ICP, we do it in broad terms. We do it by sector. We do it by size of company. The more we can understand how our product solves problems for our customers, the easier we can adapt that why into other areas, or really narrow down our ICP to focus on companies that can benefit the most. Third, explore alternative product applications. And I'm not necessarily suggesting new product development, because product development is difficult and takes a long time. But how we talk about our products is easy, and we can change that overnight. So maybe there are different ways to use our product, or maybe there are different features within our product that are more beneficial than others, or maybe there's certain features that can be applied to different markets in different ways. So again, we need to be creative. We need to sometimes think outside the box and find different ways to leverage what we already have in different ways. Next, we have to update our messaging. We need to acknowledge what is going on. I think we need to be a little more kind and caring and concerned about people that we're reaching out to, and acknowledge that times may be tough. But I think we need to also align what it is that we're selling with the current environment. So part of that is really focusing on how you help. People are generally not looking for your product. What they are interested in is how you can help them. And part of our kinder and gentler messaging is also not necessarily assuming you can help, but helping your prospects understand and identify the problems and why they should be interested in talking to you. So if you say something like, if you're struggling with this particular area, then this is something that we can help with. So help them recognize where you can help and how you can help. And then you can start the conversation and get into how you can deliver that help and what that's going to look like. And similarly, sell the solution, not the product. If you're starting your pitch with, we have this product, then you're unlikely to be successful unless the prospect is explicitly looking for that product. If you talk about the outcome or the results, and your prospect is interested and recognizes that outcome can help, then you can start to talk about the product, because the product is just a vehicle to deliver the result. It's the result that the customer is going to buy. So focus on the solution. Next point is, you really need to understand the challenges that your ideal customer is going through and figure out how you align with them. And, if you're not talking to your customers, or you don't spend a lot of time talking to your customers and digging beneath the surface to really understand how and why they're using your solution, now may be a good time. You may be able to reach out and make sure everything's okay and your customers are doing well, but then dig a little bit to understand more about what they're going through, and then figure out who else is going through similar challenges and use that learning to apply and address the other prospects that you have potential with. And then finally, you may just need to be more creative with your contracts or your deal structure, or your terms. If you have a big churn risk, you may need to be flexible with payment terms, or maybe offer discounts or pause to minimize churn and retain more customers. If you're having difficulty closing a deal, then maybe get creative with the contract structure. If you have product subscription tiers, maybe introduce some different tiers that are more accessible to the market that you're trying to reach. Think back to when you first started your company, there were things that you did at the very early stages that you'll probably never do again, but you did them because you had to get those first few customers, because you had to establish yourself in the market. It's a similar situation now. I think we do anything that we can, anything that we need to do to keep our business going. So I hope some of those will work for you. I'm going to open it now to questions.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, anybody? We have some time. Anybody with questions?
Hi, Mike. I have a question. Thank you very much for the great talk. It was really impressive. Because one thing I want to ask about some sort of markets, especially international markets, because I'm currently staying in Melbourne because Canada closed the border. So we are all kind of hesitating if we have to pursue that international sort of business engagement, if it's possible, because otherwise a lot of global market might be shut down and everything's going to be narrowed down. So it's kind of hard to start that kind of global engagement in a way. So should we wait, or should we just prepare in that moment? That kind of question. And also we were thinking about just combining a bit of hardware and then virtual reality sort of kind of headsets, but it's really, really challenging to pursue that sort of virtual reality or sort of augmented reality, that kind of shared experience. So it's better to we just wait, or better to just change the targeting, that kind of thing. So just because everything is on control and unexpected, it's really hard to plan the things. So just would be great if you kind of advise for us.
Right. Little difficult to accurately respond without really understanding your product, or how you're operating. I think waiting is never my first choice. I think waiting has two problems. One is that we don't get anything done. And two, we fall behind. So I think it's always better to find a way to get things done now. You asked about international markets. Again, I think location matters less now than ever. because nobody's traveling, nobody's meeting face to face. We're doing everything remotely. So I think that levels the field a little bit. If you are selling hardware, I know there can be some supply chain challenges. It can be difficult to get parts. There can be delays in shipping. I would, if I were selling hardware, and I were able to sell hardware, I would still take orders, with shipping delays. If I had to pivot to a different market that was ready to buy right now, then I would rather do that. I kind of go back to my three options. Selling now is the best option. And if I can't sell now, then I'll build pipeline. And if I can't build pipeline, then I guess I'll wait. But while I'm waiting, I'm going to try and figure out how I can build pipeline, how I can get conversations started, and hopefully how I can sell. Does that help?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question? Hi. So thank you so much for the presentation. Really impressive and very useful, especially this time. I represent again the hardware companies, so we really feel the delays with the shipment of the components and to serve our clients. So, and I'm wondering how the North American companies, what is their perception of the new European technology and the new companies that don't have yet any traction in North American market? Is that the challenge, and probably some advice how to overcome that barrier, because it's always very challenging to be first and to take your first pilot with someone or make first sales. After that, when you have already the feedback and you can forecast some further steps, but to be in the very beginning, it's really challenging. So probably a few advice from your side in this matter.
Just to clarify, the question was around European companies selling into North America without an established presence.
Right.
Okay.
Not yet established presence, just penetrating.
Right. Okay. That's a good question. I think it's a good question, but I don't think it's all that dissimilar from any startup selling into any market without an established presence. So anytime you're trying to acquire your first customer, it can be challenging. Specifically to North America, Canadians have a bit of a reputation for being more conservative, more polite. Americans have a reputation for making decisions quicker, for being a little, less risk averse, a little bit less polite as well. Also market much larger. But having said that, I think anytime we're trying to break into a new market, whether it's foreign or local, there's a few things that we need to do. One is just be confident and bold and act as if. And when I say act as if, I mean, don't act like you're a small company that's trying to get your first customer in a new market. Act like you're an established company. You may have heard the expression, fake it until you make it. I think a lot of times new companies are very defensive and feel that like they have to have a case study or they have to have an established customer base. We don't always have that. So part of it is just coming in with a lot of confidence and a very bold effort. Part of it is maybe figuring out, again, this goes back to ICP, what type of customer is most likely to be willing to to be the first customer. And if you're trying to sell to much larger companies, if you're trying to sell to more conservative type of companies, that may be more challenging than a company that's in a slightly different position. So when I said our ICP is not necessarily who we want to sell to, it's who's the best fit right now. And a lot of companies will break into a market, establish a niche, and they'll grow from there. And we do have a lot more flexibility. Once we have an established presence, we can grow, we can expand, we can change. But you do also have to be prepared to answer the question of why should I be your first customer? And how can I mitigate my risk by being your first customer? And I think two things there. One is, hopefully you've got a good established presence somewhere. So if you do have solid validation in other markets, that's going to help. And then the second thing is, again, we do things to get our first customer that we'll never do again. So potentially special terms, conditions, services, incentives, whatever that may be. It's often worth doing that to secure our first customer. And, if you're going to make those concessions, I think it's also fair to ask for something from that customer in return. Like they'll do a case study, they'll be a reference, they'll refer other potential prospects to you. And I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask people for referrals or references, but we need to remember that it's in our customers' best interests that we be healthy, successful companies. Because if we're healthy and successful, then we can continue to invest in product development and support, and we can take better care of them. So we shouldn't be shy for asking for their help and their support, especially if we're having a conversation around, I'm going to be your first customer, how can I mitigate the risk? Well, I can mitigate the risk by helping make sure that we establish a solid presence in your market.
All right. Thank you so much. That definitely helps.
Good. Any other questions?
Yes, Mike. Can I? My question. Can you hear me? Yes, Mike.
Yes.
My question is about if we should try to focus, or what would be the best strategy to choose our ideal customer persona? Because as you said, startups are trying to bring a new product, break into a new market, and maybe big companies are more well established and they are not as risk takers as like smaller companies, or companies engage more actively with incubators or the ecosystem, right? So what advice could you give us in that to chart our strategy to target our early innovators? Thank you.
Okay. I think it starts with why. If you've read Simon Sinek or seen any of his presentations, he says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So I think you ask yourself, like, why would somebody buy my product? What problem do I solve? What's the most important problem I solve? Or what's the best opportunity that my product creates for my potential customer? And then who has that problem, or who needs that opportunity? And why do they need that? And sometimes, if we have, like, sometimes we have something where it's a product that's built for a bank, or it's a product that fits into a car. So, you know, there are elements of our product that fit us into a certain segment. But then we need to figure out, you know, who within that segment has the most need, and what's the why behind that. So a lot of times it comes down to workflow, how the company operates, or sometimes it's a combination of technologies they use, or sometimes it's the type of market they're in. So I guess, again, it's hard without knowing what the product or solution is, but it's really digging into what is the most compelling aspect of my product, and who needs that, and why do they need that, and then you match that up to define your ICP.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mike, for the presentation. Actually, what if our customers required a sort of, after the demo, required a sort of visiting other customers? Our products required lots of interaction, especially with seniors. So it's really hard especially during this time, to interact with them. And when you go to another customer, again, they need to see another seniors. So it's really hard for that. So what's the suggestion for us? Do we keep going to, it's a long-term care. Do we go there for them? Do we just keep waiting, just opening channels? They are really busy, and there is lots of issues there.
Yeah, okay. So I think I'm going to maybe answer this a little more generally, because another question I get a lot is, how do I respond to requests for references? How do I respond to requests for, you know, visiting customer sites? And how do I respond to requests for, I need to try your product for a certain amount of time before I make a decision? And so I think those are all sort of common questions. I think we always want to control the sales process ourselves as much as we can. And in order to do that, we really need to understand the buying criteria. So what do you need to see to make a buying decision? So I guess coming back to your question, why do they need that visit? Why do they need to talk to somebody? What is it that they haven't seen that I've been unable to communicate that's preventing you from moving forward with the decision? So how do we find another way to satisfy that need without actually doing the visit or talking to the other person? And if you can identify that clearly and find a way to show that, maybe that overcomes the need. If you can't, then it's difficult. You know, maybe you develop a library, like a video library, where you have people talking about how they use whatever it is that you sell. Or maybe you can write some content, or have a case study, or other tools at your disposal that are available. But I think the ideal path is find out how you can satisfy the need yourself, if that's at all possible.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Anybody else with any last questions?
Can I ask one more question? If that's fine.
No worries. Go ahead.
So the question is, how do people in North America feel about the cold calls? for instance, and if that calls are made by, let's say, some agency, not the employees of the company, is that a practice, and how does it work? Do you have any practices in this field?
Yeah, so I think cold calling is becoming increasingly difficult because people get a lot of calls. I think part of it depends on who you're calling. You know, there are people that have to answer the phone because there may be potential clients or customers on the other end. So, for example, if you're selling to real estate agents, very easy to find their phone number and they will pick up the call. You know, there are other buyer personas, a lot of senior executives, very difficult to reach by phone. But I think you have to try. And you know, any time I'm working with a company on developing an outbound cadence, I think it's important to mix email, phone calls, maybe other social touches, because you know the goal is generally to have a conversation. And if you're not making phone calls, then you're probably not going to have a conversation. You know, you're going to rely on a response to an email or other social interaction. So if you don't call, you don't have a chance to talk. But I think even if somebody doesn't pick up the phone, your voicemail is another way to deliver a message. So if you're going to leave a voicemail, you know, make it concise, have a nice, tight, compelling message, deliver it with enthusiasm, with a smile. You're demonstrating your persistence. It's another way to deliver the message. Sometimes a voicemail will motivate a response to an email, and you get a dialogue started that way. So I think, you know, until there's a better way, I think cold calling is an important part of any outbound process. And yes, there are agencies that do that. So, you know, that's a potential option. I guess my only caution on third-party agencies is they've got to have really good messaging. And, you know, if they're not going to know a lot about your solution, then they've got to be really focused on navigating the call towards setting up a meeting. And not try to take on too much where they risk actually killing the chance of getting that meeting.
Yeah, right. Understood. Thank you so much.